Somewhere in Britain right now, millions of people are going about ordinary lives and carrying extraordinary DNA they know nothing about. Viking DNA, not a trace, not a curiosity, a measurable, significant genetic signature hiding inside the British population. The history books told us the Vikings raided, then left. The DNA tells a completely different story. And if you carry British ancestry, if your family comes from Yorkshire, East Anglia, Lincolnshire, or the Scottish Isles, this changes your story too. Let us go back, far back, to understand what the Vikings were before they became a legend. The people we call Vikings were not a single nation. They were farming and fishing communities across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. They shared a language, a mythology, a boat-building tradition. But they were not a unified empire waiting to conquer. What the world remembers is the raiding. The 9th century raids on Lindisfarne, on Dublin, on the Seine. Brutal, rapid, devastating. But the raids were only the beginning. What followed was something far more consequential for the people of Britain. They settled, they farmed, they married, they stayed. Now here is where the DNA evidence becomes remarkable, because for a long time, historians assumed that Norse settlement left only a shallow genetic mark on Britain. The prevailing view was that the Anglo-Saxons had already so thoroughly replaced the earlier British population that Vikings were just one more layer in an already complicated story. That assumption has been overturned, decisively. Researchers at the University of Oxford, working with the People of the British Isles project, sampled DNA from thousands of people whose grandparents were all born in the same rural area. By controlling for recent migration, they were able to see the ancient genetic landscape of Britain, what it looked like before the modern mixing began. What they found was a clear Scandinavian genetic cluster, concentrated in the north and east of England, Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, the East Midlands, Norfolk. In those regions, modern people carry between 6 and 10% Scandinavian ancestry on average. Some individuals carry considerably more. 6 to 10% might sound modest, but translate it into actual ancestors and the weight of it changes entirely. Go back 30 generations, roughly 1,000 years, and you have over 1 billion theoretical ancestors in your family tree. 6% of those are Norse, that is 60 million individuals. These were not strangers who passed through. They were your ancestors. But before we go further into what the DNA found, we need to understand the Scandinavian genetic profile itself, because the Vikings were not genetically uniform either. Ancient DNA work led by researchers at the University of Copenhagen has shown that the Viking Age Scandinavian population itself carried layers of ancestry. They were a mixture of the original Scandinavian hunter-gatherer lineage and the Yamnaya-descended steppe pastoralists who had swept into northern Europe thousands of years earlier. That steppe ancestry gave the Norse population its distinctive genetic profile, one that stands clearly apart from the earlier Celtic and Anglo-Saxon populations of Britain, which means when geneticists look at ancient British DNA from the Danelaw period, they can actually identify Norse ancestry individuals with real precision. They are not guessing. They are reading a signature written in ancient bone. Now let us follow the migration itself, because understanding how the Norse came to Britain, and in what numbers, is essential to understanding why their DNA survived. The raids began in the late 8th century. Lindisfarne, 793 AD. A shock, a rupture, the beginning of a century of escalating Norse presence. But the great heathen army that arrived in 865 was something different. This was not a raid. This was a migration force. They took York. They took East Anglia. They controlled a swath of northern and eastern England that would become known as the Danelaw. The Danelaw was not an occupation zone. It was a society, Norse law, Norse language, Norse landholding patterns, and where Norse law held for generations, Norse people lived, farmed, had children. Those children had children. The genetic signal we measure today in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire is the direct biological inheritance of those households. But Yorkshire was not the only place. The Norse went further, and the DNA shows it. The Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland, were so thoroughly settled by Norse migrants that they are genetically closer to Norway today than to mainland Scotland. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh found that Orcadians carry roughly 25% Norwegian ancestry. 1 in 4 of their ancestral lines run straight back to Scandinavia. 25%. If you have Orcadian ancestry, a quarter of you is Norse. That is not a trace. That is a defining part of who you are. The Western Scottish Islands tell a related story. The Hebrides carry measurable Norse ancestry, the legacy of the Kingdom of the Isles, a Norse-Gaelic hybrid polity that held power for centuries. And the Isle of Man, sitting in the middle of the Irish Sea, equidistant from Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia, carries one of the heaviest Norse genetic signatures in the whole Atlantic world. Now we reach the turning point. The event that, more than any other, determined how deeply Norse DNA would become woven into the British genetic fabric. Stamford Bridge, 1066. Harold Hardrada's invasion repulsed, the last great Norse attempt to retake England, defeated. That defeat did not remove the Norse from Britain. It simply stopped the flow of new Norse arrivals. The people already there, the Danelaw settlers, their children, their grandchildren, remained. And here is the genetic significance of that moment. The Norse who had settled were not expelled. They were absorbed. Their genes went with them into the English population. David Reich's team at Harvard has shown through ancient DNA analysis that absorbed migrant populations often leave a genetic signal far larger than their historical numbers suggested. The reason? Migrant groups who settled permanently had more descendants per generation than the narrative of their numbers implied. They were farmers, they had large families, they survived. Now let us look at the surnames. Because the DNA evidence does not stand alone, it is corroborated by one of the most visible cultural artifacts still living in modern Britain. Norse place names and surnames remain embedded across the English landscape and population, like fossils of the settlement itself. The suffix by means farm or settlement in Old Norse. Grimsby, Whitby, Selby, Rugby. 40% of English place names in the Danelaw region contain Norse elements. Thwaite, a clearing. Garth, an enclosure. Beck, a stream. These are not loanwords. These are the spoken footprints of people who settled and named what they found. Surnames carry the same signal. Johnson, son of John, yes, but also a Norse patronymic pattern. Swanson, Gunnison, Thorburn. Still in the phone book, still in the DNA. The University of Leicester's surname study found that men carrying certain Norse-derived surnames showed matching Y chromosome haplotypes associated with Scandinavian origin. Name and gene. Aligned. The surname carried the identity, and the DNA carried the biology, and 1,500 years later, they still match. Now the Y chromosome matters enormously here, because Norse men came in significant numbers, and the Y chromosome passes from father to son, unbroken. The R1a haplogroup, associated with Scandinavian and broader Indo-European ancestry, is elevated in the north and east of England compared to the south and west. That geographic pattern, elevated Norse Y chromosome markers in precisely the regions of historical Danelaw settlement, is not a coincidence. It is a biological map of the Viking Age. Think about what that means. The political boundary of the Danelaw, drawn in treaty between Alfred the Great and the Norse leader Guthrum in 886 AD, is still visible in modern British DNA. A political agreement made in the 9th century is encoded in the biology of millions of living people. That is the reach of history into the present. Now let us talk about the women, because the genetic story of Norse settlement in Britain is not only about warriors and chieftains. Mitochondrial DNA, which passes through the female line, also shows a Norse signature in British populations, particularly in the northern regions. This matters because the presence of Norse mitochondrial DNA means Norse women came too. This was not a conquest, this was a family migration. Archaeological evidence from Norse period burial sites in York, Lincoln and the Scottish Isles confirms female Norse burials. Women buried with Norse grave goods, Norse jewellery, Norse identity. These were not slaves or captives. These were women who lived as Norse women in Britain, were buried as Norse women, and whose DNA passed down the female line into living British people. Now let us follow the story north to where the Norse imprint is deepest of all, and where it survived almost undiluted by subsequent migration. Shetland was Norse territory from the 9th century. Its people spoke Norn, a language derived from Old Norse, until the 18th century. The language died. The DNA did not. Shetlanders today carry Norse ancestry at levels that dwarf the English average. Some studies estimate up to 44% Scandinavian ancestry in the core Shetland population. Nearly half. If you have Shetland ancestry, you are nearly as Norse as you are anything else. That is not a heritage footnote. That is who you fundamentally are. And here is the wider implication. The British population is not a single genetic entity. It is a mosaic, and the Norse tile in that mosaic is far larger than history acknowledged. The people of the British Isles study identified 17 distinct genetic clusters across Britain, and the northern and eastern clusters carry clear Scandinavian influence. 17 clusters. 17 distinct ancestral stories, all living inside one island. The Norse story is one of the most consequential. Now let us look at what else survived, because the Norse left their mark on the British people not only genetically, but physically. The elevated frequency of light eyes and fair hair in northern England and Scotland is partly a Norse inheritance, though it is complicated because earlier populations also carried these traits. What the DNA can say more precisely is this: the specific combination of gene variants for eye color, stature, and certain immune markers found in northern English populations does align with Scandinavian populations. Your immune system may carry a Norse legacy. Certain Certain HLA gene variants, which determine how your body responds to infection, show elevated Scandinavian frequencies in northern British populations. The body you live in was shaped partly by ancestors who crossed the North Sea 1,000 years ago. That is not metaphor. That is molecular biology. Now let us address the question the genetics cannot answer on its own. How many Norse people actually settled in Britain? Because numbers matter to understanding the genetic inheritance. Historians have debated this for decades. Early estimates were low, tens of thousands. More recent genetic modeling suggests the number was significantly higher. Genetic modeling by researchers, including those working with the Poby study, suggests Norse settlement in some regions may have represented between 10 and 20% of the local population. Enough to leave the signal we still detect. 10 to 20% of a local population is enough to change the genetic character of a region permanently across 1,000 years of intermarriage. That intermarriage is the engine, not the raids, not the battles. The quiet daily reality of Norse farmers and English farmers living in adjacent fields, trading, borrowing tools, falling in love. Their children would have spoken Old English with Norse loanwords. The language we call Middle English carries approximately 3,000 Norse-derived words. Sky, egg, window, knife, husband, ugly, want. Every time you use these words, you are using the verbal DNA of the Norse settlement of Britain. The language absorbed the Norse input, the genome absorbed it, the place names absorbed it, the surnames absorbed it. This was a thorough cultural and biological merger, and that is why, 900 years after Stamford Bridge, a man in Yorkshire or a woman in Shetland can take a DNA test and find Scandinavia looking back at them from their own results. The Norwegian ancestry on his results, the Swedish marker in her mitochondrial line. These are not errors or artifacts. They are real. They are ancient. They are him. They are her. Let us now consider what the Norse contribution means at the broadest scale, because this is not just a British story. The Norse who settled in Britain were part of the most far-reaching maritime expansion in pre-Columbian world history. Their genes went everywhere their ships went. The Normans who conquered England in 1066 were themselves Norse-descended. Their name, Normans, means Northmen, Viking settlers in northern France, speaking French but carrying Norse genes. So, the Norman conquest brought a second wave of Norse genetic input into Britain. From the south, this time, filtered through 2 centuries of French intermarriage, but Norse at its root. Britain was shaped by the Norse from 2 directions. From the north and east in the 9th and 10th centuries. From the south in 1066. The island sat in the middle of a Norse world. And if your ancestry includes any of the British aristocratic surnames that Norman settlers introduced, Beaumont, Percy, Clifford, Neville, you are carrying Norse ancestry laundered through French. Here is the personal payoff, the one that matters most. And I want you to sit with it for a moment. If you have British ancestry, particularly from the north or east of England, from Scotland, from the Northern Isles, you are likely carrying Viking DNA right now. Not the Viking of the popular imagination, the helmet, the axe, the bloodthirst, the real Viking. A farmer, a sailor, a woodworker, a mother carrying her family's possessions onto a beach in East Yorkshire. That woman is your ancestor. She carried the DNA you carry today. She built the farm that became the village that carries the Norse name you drive past on the motorway. The DNA is the deepest archive we have. More reliable than the chronicle, more personal than the place name. It is the record written in you. The scholars who dismissed Viking settlement as genetically shallow were working with incomplete tools. Ancient DNA analysis has changed everything. The picture that emerges is far richer. Britain is not a Celtic island with a Viking footnote. It is a genuinely Norse-touched nation, in its language, its surnames, its place names, its laws, and its DNA. The Vikings did not disappear from Britain in 1066. They became Britain. They became the English farmer, the Scottish crofter, the Orcadian fisherman, the Yorkshire miner. They became you. The DNA test that shows Scandinavian ancestry in a person who thought they were simply English is not an anomaly. It is the correct answer. Somewhere in the north of England, or on an island off the Scottish coast, your family tree has a route that reaches back across the North Sea to a timber farmhouse in Norway or Denmark. That route is still alive. It is alive in you.